Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
And thank you for being here today. My name is Moya Maps, and I am one of the postdoctoral fellows here at the McCoy Family Center for Ethics in Society. And for those of us who work in ethics and social philosophy, to be invited to deliver the Tanner Lectures is among the highest of professional honors, and it is an honor that Tommie Shelby richly deserves. Tommie Shelby is the Lee Simpkins Family Professor of Arts and Sciences and Caldwell Titcomb Professor of African and African American Studies and of Philosophy at Harvard. And over the past 2 days, he has taken the best of analytic philosophy, its thoroughness, its precision, and used it to help us think more clearly about pressing social and political problems. Very, very briefly, in his first lecture, Dr. Shelby analyzed the nature of racial stereotyping and explored the question of when and why it morally wrongs. One of his central cases was the case of Miss Johnson. Miss Johnson is a character who's a high school teacher who believes that as a matter of biology, Blacks are less intelligent than their white and Asian counterparts. But she bears no ill will towards her Black students, just the contrary. She takes it as part of her duty as a teacher to set all of her students up equally for academic success, and so she dedicates extra time and energy to supporting her Black students. Although Miss Johnson is clearly in the grips of a false and negative race-based stereotype, on Professor Shelby's model, she does not wrong her Black students, and by figuring out cases where racial stereotyping doesn't wrong, it helps us to get a more clear picture of when and why it does wrong. In the second lecture, Dr. Shelby turned to the question of what we as Black folks should do about the wrongs of racial stereotyping. He divides the Black political tradition of racial uplift programs into two basic types: inward-facing initiatives and outward-facing initiatives. And while Black folks have widely embraced the first, these days we tend to be much more wary of the second. Dr. Shelby considers a range of objections to outward-facing initiatives. For example, that they are too concerned with the opinions of white people, or that while a politics of respectability might serve the interests of the most privileged Black folks, it is unhelpful or even counterproductive for the least well-off among us. Although Dr. Shelby takes these worries very seriously and treats them with, I think, an admirable sort of precision, he ultimately argues that we nevertheless have good reason to pursue counter-stereotypic personal conduct as an outward-facing political project. Now, the format for today is a little bit different, so I'm going to give just a quick overview. Today we have two commentators, Brian Lowry and Lerone Martin. Brian Lowry is the Walter Kenneth Kilpatrick Professor of Organizational Behavior, and he was recently named the founding co-director of Stanford's new Institute on Race. His research examines the reality that others shape ourselves and that we shape theirs, exploring issues ranging from the nature of racial and gender identities to an understanding of how others help us generate meaning in life. His latest book is Selfless: The Social Creation of You. Lerone Martin is the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor in Religious Studies and the director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute here at Stanford. His latest book is The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover: How the FBI Aided and Abetted the Rise of White Christian Nationalism. Dr. Lowry, and Dr. Martin will each have 15 minutes to give their comments. Then they will have 30 minutes of conversation with Dr. Shelby, and then we'll have a little under an hour, maybe a little bit closer to 40 minutes for Q&A with all of you. Please join me in welcoming our first commentator, Dr. Brian Lowry.
All right, good morning. So I'm a social psychologist. This is a little loud. Am I really loud? Can we turn this down a little bit?
That's great.
You're fine.
All right, okay. I'm a social psychologist by discipline and probably temperament. That will be reflected in the kind of the second part of my comments. There are going to be two parts. The first part will just be a very simple, easy question. I think Professor Shelby can manage quite easily. And the second part will be a longer thought about counter-stereotypic behavior as a response to the burdens carried by Black people in this country and in other ethnic minorities. The first question is about statistical discrimination. So I'm in the business school. I deal with a lot of economists. Maybe some of you are in the room. And one of the things that they talk about is statistical discrimination, which differs in a lot of ways from the kind of wrongs that stereotypes that permit that Professor Shelby talked about, in that one of the clear wrongs is that taking a stereotype and applying it to a particular individual is wrong for a variety or a number of reasons. But what I'm more interested in is the comparative nature of stereotypes. And when you think about statistical discrimination, what you're really focused on is the comparative nature of stereotypes. And I think this is incredibly relevant right now as we think about affirmative action and other policies shifting in this country. So as an example, you have two people that are applying for a job or two students that are applying for a college. You know, they seem about equivalent. One is white, one is Black. A lot of available evidence suggests that white students will score higher. White students will do better. Like, this is what the available evidence says, right? If you just look objectively at the empirics, that's what you see. So should you, in the presence of imperfect information, weigh that in the decision that you make, right? This is a simple way to talk about statistical discrimination, right? Why shouldn't I hire the white guy, given what I know about white people in the population relative to Black people in the population? That does not require me to make an assumption about the Black person in particular. It doesn't require me to assume that I'm apply a stereotype to them, but it's still obviously a burden that people, subordinate groups would carry in the society. Is that morally permissible? That's kind of the simple question. Is the application of demographic generalities morally permissible? And we do this all the time, and nobody has any concern about it when we think about things like marketing, right? Marketing uses demographic generalizations. When we think about all kinds of policy, there's no social policy that does not rely on demographic generalizations. Is it inappropriate or morally impermissible to have an individual use that same kind of information to make a decision in purely pragmatic terms? So no bias, no prejudice, no desire to discriminate as a function of personal animus, but simply trying to make the best pragmatic decision. Is it permissible to use that information? So that's I think the easy first question. I'm no philosopher, but I assume that's child's play for you all. Okay. On the second question of the strategy of counter-stereotypic behavior. When we were at dinner last night, Professor Shelby told a story about him as an adolescent on a basketball court, shooting baskets by himself. A young white kid, maybe half his age, is riding around his bike, calls him ugly, right? And he doesn't know this kid. This kid doesn't know him. He's like, what am I supposed to do with this, right? This is a story. So I will just say this. The reason I bring that story up is because it sparked a story for me, right? So I'll tell you my story, and I'm gonna go from my story as opposed to Professor Shelby's story, because this story I know better. I'm a little bit older than 12 or so. I am on an NSF panel, a grant panel. So we're in DC. We're going through these grant proposals. One of the proposals is examining something about race and attractiveness and, social bias, blah, blah, blah. In this panel, a professor, well-known professor, says, I don't understand this. We all know that black people are less attractive than white people. She asserts this in the room. And now I'm thinking, what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to say? I'm a black person in the room, and there's a black grant officer. And actually, I don't say anything because I'm stunned by this. And so this is the first day of the panel. We go back the next day, and the question is, what should I have done on the second day? Let's call it the second day, right? I've had a chance to digest this. I can go in with a plan as opposed to responding in the moment, right? It's not a one-off. How do I address this? Now, I understand that in Professor Shelby's comments or in lectures, he pointed out that the counter-stereotypic behavior is not for things that are just pure ethnocentrism. So you could argue that attractiveness shouldn't matter very much. It's not like intelligence or hardworkingness or criminality, but I'm going to push back against that a little bit because the burden associated with attractiveness bias is very high, right? So we know that the attractiveness bias carries a lot of weight, that things like the jobs you get, how people respond to you, all these things that matter to you are affected by perceived attractiveness. So I'm just going to just stipulate that this matters. This is not simply like how you wear your hair. This is a meaningful stereotype. And so the question about how should I respond to this is in part dependent upon the effectiveness of the potential response, right? And first, I will just say there's lots of reasons to believe that my attempt to disabuse her of this will be unsuccessful, right? And so she's had, this is not a young person, right? She's had plenty of life experience. She's seen people, TV, she's seen people, right? So she might have even said in this that Denzel Washington, yeah, but that's an exception. Dismissed, right? So the one person she could think of that apparently the one attractive black man she's ever seen. She just dismisses this. So my first thought is like, I don't think that I'm in a position to disprove this. And a larger point to be made is, at that point in life, if there's not been enough evidence to disprove, then further empirical evidence is unlikely to change the attitude. And so it seems to me that counter-stereotypic behavior, and this is true across different types of bias, are unlikely to produce a change, in part because it's unlikely that the error is truly an epistemic error, that it's motivated. And it might be motivated not by necessarily personal animus, but the nature of social power is that it is corrupting. It is morally corrupting. It produces biases, some that you're aware of and some that you aren't aware of, that make it difficult for you to overcome what looks like a pure epistemic error because it's actually driven by processes that are motivated. It's a motivational process. And I think it's important here to note, again, that I'm a social psychologist. I think that it's the social situation that is corrupting. It's not that the person is necessarily just corrupt as by nature. It's that the situation they find themselves in is corrupting them. And it's difficult to overcome the corruption associated with power. And there's a lot of evidence, and if you're interested, we can talk about it in social psychology about the corrupting nature of power. And so if you believe that to be true, then what's the other option? And I'm going to argue that the other option is one in which I focus on making sure that person gets their grant approved, right? And it's not necessarily that person, but the larger point is you focus on changing the circumstance that is corrupting that person and simultaneously reducing the burden of the people that are subordinated by increasing the power of the subordinated group, therefore also providing the dominant group with the possibility of moral uplift by removing the corrupting nature of the social power they have, right? So what I would argue is that a good use of energy would be to maximize your power in the name of the power of the social group, and doing that actually with the minimum necessary regard for the white person that you're engaging with, because in part the corrupting influence is the excess of regard that they have. The excess regard that white people have, I'd argue, is corrupting, is morally corrupting. And that as an individual, when you engage with someone and you contribute to that excess of regard, that you are contributing to their moral corruption. So not only are you serving the society at large, I'd argue, by reducing the moral distance, you also are in some sense engaging in moral uplift of the dominant person that you're engaging with by removing the corrupting influence of that social distance, of that social power. Okay, I don't have that much more, so don't worry. So this strategy, I'd like to go back to the counter-stereotypic strategy for just a second and point out that it's costly. And that is, being in a subordinated group is burdensome, and doing anything to try to address that burden is also a cost. And the cost, as Professor Shelby noted, is in part in freedom, because you could do something else, but there's also opportunity cost. To engage in one strategy is to forego others potentially, right? And the question then becomes, what's the most efficient strategy? There will be a cost to bear. So I am not suggesting that what my idea of trying to increase your social power is cost-free. You make decisions that also limit your freedom. You do things in response to what someone else has said. You are responding. It's not cost-free. The question is it a more efficient use of the energy you have available to you to solve the problem that you're facing? And so the argument I'm making is that it's potentially a more efficient use of energy, not that it is cost-free, right? So, and as an example, going back, what could I have done when faced with that person who says black people are not attractive? I could have gone back to my room, did all I could to become more attractive and convince her that somehow, though Denzel Washington couldn't convince her, I'm gonna convince her that I'm more attractive. That seems like a foolish strategy, but it's a strategy, right? I could have done things, I could have comported myself, I could have tried to generate a sense of, in some way, that this is a mistake that you're making, counter-stereotypic behavior. Or here's a strategy that is also costly. I could have tickled her fear a little bit in service of trying to influence how she responded to me to increase the likelihood of this person getting a grant proposal. And I bring that up because it's a very different strategy. I could have chosen to come in dressed in a way that was designed to, and this is something that for people this is something that I think about a lot, which tells you something about me. But I am aware that my physical presentation affects how people respond to me. And I assume you all are aware of that. As a black man, there are subtleties. I understand there are ways that I can appear open and nice and friendly and look like, I'm not threatening. And there are subtle things I can do that might make you wonder, even though I'm a professor. I can tickle the fears that you have that you're not aware of simply by how I choose to present myself. Should I do that in service of increasing the influence I have in this situation, right? That is a choice I could make, right? And I would do that with little regard for her except for how do I influence her behavior. That's a choice, it's a strategy. And the question is, of these strategies, how do you think about what people should do? The other thing I'll say on this is, this also does not get around Professor Shelby's concern that this might be in service of me, right? That you have people who are, in some sense, taking advantage of these strategies simply to increase their own outcomes without concern for the outcomes of their group or even the wider society. And what I would say about that is true of this strategy. There's no reason to assume that this strategy, if I engage in that strategy, I'm necessarily doing it in service of some wider goal. But I think that's also true of the counter-stereotypic strategy. I don't think that does not differentiate the two. And so on the whole, I would argue that a strategy by which the focus is not on changing the hearts and minds of the individuals, but rather in changing the social circumstances that produces the biases that affect their hearts and minds, is a more effective strategy than focusing on hearts and minds and hoping that then changes behavior. So with that, I'll stop.
I want to thank Professor Shelby for these lectures. I have 3 questions I'll raise. I was raised in the Baptist church, so having 3 points when you get up to speak is very important. So reading these lectures, my first question is, what happened in the hotel lobby, in the hotel hallway? I'm interested in this as an African-American man, and I'm interested in this because I want to figure out how we are to apply this counter-stereotype resistance in the example you gave in your first lecture, opening up about walking down the hallway. Reading this was at times, I told Professor Shelby, like watching a horror film, right? No, Tommie, don't go down the hallway. Wait, stop, don't go. But I want to know, what do we do in those instances? And I recall being a young man being confronted with this, as Brian mentioned as well, and having different strategies that weren't really all that well thought out. There were times in situations like this happened to me that I would be upset, and I would address my interlocutor as such. And then as I got a little older in graduate school, and you stay up late and you're talking with your friends, we all decided to develop a strategy where we would keep our cool in situations where stereotypes would impact us. And then we would refuse to carry the burden of trying to change someone's mind. And we would ask the question, I'm curious as to why you X, right? So in a situation with myself, being at an event, dressed the way that I am right now, I spoke at the event, we went outside, everyone's standing in line waiting for their cars, and a white person hands me their keys because they assume I'm the valet, right? And so the old, younger me would have addressed them in an assertive tone. The refined me, at least I like to think refined, simply said, I'm curious what it is about me that makes you think I'm the valet, as a way to try to push the burden back onto this other person. But I'm not quite sure that strategy worked, because oftentimes people would just simply say, oh, I'm sorry, just made a mistake. They didn't get that I was trying to illuminate their perhaps unconscious bias, which I recognize Professor Shelby differentiates here between stereotypes. But I realized that that strategy didn't work. So the question I have really is, what do we do in those situations, Professor Shelby? I'm asking for a friend. Wink, wink. The second question I have, and I'm curious about, is as it relates to gender. And not just because we have an all-male panel, but also because I'm curious, what does gender shape how one engages in the counter-stereotype resistance? As Professor Jefferson knows, this idea of the politics of respectability that is discussed in the lectures comes from Evelyn Higginbotham. Most of you know that. But it's important to note that it comes from Evelyn Higginbotham's study of Black church women and how Black church women engaged in a politics of respectability, or respectability politics, as a way to both point out the failures of American democracy, but also as a way to organize for change. And so since this term comes from a study of African American church women, I'm curious what Professor Shelby would say. Does gender shape how we engage in a counter-stereotype resistance? A question related to that, maybe question 2B, is there something special about faith communities that can help us engage in a counter-stereotype resistance? So many faith communities, as many of you know, especially for marginalized groups, have at their core affirming the dignity and personhood of their congregation members. And they also engage in a political ethics of belief, in that they try their best to educate their congregation and parishioners about public issues. They try their best to organize groups around these public issues. So I would be curious to know if Professor Shelby thinks that our faith communities particularly positioned to help us engage in a counter-stereotype resistance. Now, finally, I'd like to ask a question around, as a historian, around Are there any folks in history Professor Shelby thinks model this behavior for us? I'm really curious about that. And I want to ask, not just because of my position here, the Martin Luther King, director of the Martin Luther King Research and Education Institute, but because of Professor Shelby's own interest. As many of you know, he edited in 2018, along with Brandon Terry, a wonderful book on Martin Luther King Jr. So I'd like to ask specifically about historical figures. Do you see Martin King as embodying the counter-stereotype resistance that you put forward? Now, I want to read two aspects of Martin King to get us started in thinking about this. And I want to focus on King's sermons because I think King's sermons are a place, as Professor Shelby points out in the edited volume, that we can really see King being a political thinker. And in the sermons, he's addressing African-American congregations. So not writing for a broad audience, but actually writing for African-Americans. So here are two portions of sermons that I want to read to get us thinking about where does King fit in this counter-stereotype resistance. The first is a sermon from 1947 delivered at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, 1957 at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And the title of the sermon is Overcoming an Inferiority Complex. King says, in our society in which it's so easy for us to feel that we don't count, in which it's so easy to feel that we are sort of depersonalized cogs in a vast industrial machine, this question has vital significance. And this has a lot of significance for the race problem and for every Negro who stands in America. It's so easy for us to feel inferior because we have lived so long amid the tragic midnight of injustice and oppression. This one thing that the great social psychologists, shout out to Brian, have been saying across the past few years, that segregation generates a feeling of inferiority. This gives the individual under the system an inferiority complex. And then he goes on to cite some of the social psychologists of the day, Dr. Gordon Allport of Harvard, Dr. Edna Gardner Murphy of Columbia, and of course, Dr. Kenneth Clark. And then he goes on to say that these inferior feelings develop because of the system of racial segregation. And it's so easy for us to feel that we don't count, that we aren't significant, that we are less than. We stand every day before a system which says that to us. But I say to you this morning, you should go out with the assurance that you belong and that you count and that you are somebody because God loves you. And then he goes on to say, in addition to knowing that God loves you, you should, one, accept yourself. You should, two, never consider the work that you do insignificant. And three, you should give of yourself to some purpose greater than you. So it seems to me that this is a question for us about, as King addresses his congregation, about overcoming an inferiority complex, if this is a site where we can see this as engaging in counter-stereotype resistance. Finally, I also want to know is that if we see King as consciously engaging in counter-stereotypic personal conduct, and perhaps, Professor Jefferson, policing Black behavior. Now here's a sermon he gives that we'll be publishing in volume 8 of the King Papers Project next year. He gives this sermon right in the midst of the Birmingham campaign, April 10th, 1963, where they've been protesting in Birmingham for about a week, and they've been protesting along the lines of not shopping and not buying segregation. This is what King says. Now, there are 2 or 3 things that we must do if this job is going to be done. We have asked every freedom-loving Negro of self-respect in Birmingham, Alabama, to refuse to shop in the stores downtown or in the shopping centers around the town. And we're only going to buy food and medicine. Now, you see that we have on our blue jeans today and we have on our gray work shirts, and we are not wearing these things merely to engage in some theatrical gesture. We're wearing them to symbolize our determination to sacrifice during this period. We are wearing these things to symbolize the fact that we are not going to buy suits or shirts or shoes or socks or anything in the downtown area of Birmingham, Alabama, until the walls of segregation in these stores come tumbling down. Now we're asking you, my friends, not only to stop buying for yourself, but to tell your neighbor. And when you see any Negro shopping downtown, realize that that Negro doesn't have any self-respect. And that Negro isn't free. Now, of course, there may be some people who don't know. There may be some few people who haven't heard about our campaign. But I think the vast majority of Negroes have heard about this movement. And that means that anybody who goes downtown to shop is going so in defiance of this movement, and they are traitors to the Negro race. So I'm wondering if we could see Martin King, not the public king, but this king, as fitting into this strategy that you've laid for us here. Again, like Brian, easy questions, Professor Shelby, that I'm sure you will handle. Thank you.
Even if I had the time, I probably couldn't really answer all of these things. So maybe I'll pick a few things, and maybe as the conversation unfolds, maybe other things will occur to me, or it'll just kind of we'll get around to the things you're talking about, rather than me trying to like point by point hit things. His comments are so great and interesting. So let me maybe in talking Professor Lowry's points, talk a little about the statistical discrimination question, which is a difficult one. I think it's difficult because, we use these kind of probabilistic generalizations all the time to distribute scarce goods, right? So, even when it comes to something like admission to a selective college, we rely on all kinds of proxies for that. And in fact, things like test scores and grades are themselves proxies, right? Because we're just trying to figure out, like, there's some correlation between how you performed in the past on these in classes that you've been in on these tests and how you're going to perform when you're in college. Not the only thing, but it's some evidence for it, and we do use them. So it can't be true that it's never permissible to use these demographic generalizations. We use them all the time, and I think it's okay sometimes. So the question does naturally arise, is it okay to use them in the case of a demographic generalization about a disadvantaged group, particularly a racial group, and it's a complex one? Probably is domain specific a little bit too. Probably in some domains, it's going to be so dangerous it probably doesn't make sense to do it. Because you just know that people are likely to misuse them, bias is likely to figure in and how they apply it. And so, so in the case of like law enforcement, you probably don't really want to do that. Just because even if you thought that you have really reliable statistics and so on, it's probably unlikely to be applied in an even-handed, consistent, unbiased way. And you want to protect, especially those who are most vulnerable, from those kinds of abuses. And so some of it's a practical thing about, even though you thought there might not be anything intrinsically wrong about using that as one piece of evidence, but the worries about what might flow from that might be severe enough, stakes might be high enough that we want to prevent people from doing it. So I think in some domains we're certainly going to want to do that. And there's a further thought that the philosopher Adam Hossain wrote a really great paper about racial profiling, how to think about it, and he emphasizes like a further point about the kind of expressive wrong, if you like, that can go when you use these kinds of proxies in the context, say, of law enforcement, when you're talking about groups that are disadvantaged and already stigmatized, you're further stigmatizing them, and you're sort of, in a way, worsening their civic standing. You're kind of putting them in this situation where they can't be confident that they have equal civic standing in the polity. And so, quite apart from like the consequences of misapplication, something like that, there's this further thought that just having that this be a policy communicates something to people that you don't really want to communicate. So there are going to be cases like that, and I think that it's a hard question, like in what domains might you allow it to be one piece of input, and in what domains you want to like not allow it at all. I think it's complex, and we'd have to kind of like walk through different contexts to see when we think it might be okay. Because there's a way in which, we're also relying on it when we're doing things like trying to promote justice or promote social change. We're also relying on it. So if you thought that, as a lot of people do, that it helps to have, say, in this example of Black people, in certain roles, partly because of generalizations about the group. So if you thought, it's good to have a lot of black police officers, because not that they're not problematic too, but they're less likely to be problematic. So like you're relying on a generalization that they're probably going to take more care, to have a kind of sensitivity, a knowledge about black people, the subtle differences between them, and like that's relevant. We do the similar thing when we think it's good to have a diverse faculty. Why? Well, we think that those individuals are likely to do certain sorts of things that will be positive for the student body. So we are relying on them in some cases. In that case, so I think it was going to depend, when it's okay and when it's not. But a good question, complex one. Happy to talk more about it. Maybe I'll step back. I think this in some ways bears on comments both Professor Lowry and Professor Martin just about how I was thinking about counter stereotype resistance. So I'm thinking of this again. It's a three-pronged strategy, right? So it's not. So I would say I focus a lot on counter-stereotypic conduct because that's really controversial, and that's that's what philosophers do. You want to figure out, like, let's go to the hard case. But I do want to just remind you that it's meant to be a part of a broader program, right? And depending on the situation, the other strategies are going to be more relevant, right? So if you're sometimes what you're trying to do is just educate the broader public about the group. They don't know a lot about the group. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the group, and the more they know about it, that's better. Like you see, there's actually real diversity in the group. They have all these different sorts of traits, and that can be done lots of ways. Right? As educators, again, we do that too. Right? Part of when I've been teaching in an African American Studies department now for now going on 24 years, and part of what we do in educating the student body, not just our black students, but all the students, right, is help them understand things about black life, black thought, how in the history of blacks in this country and elsewhere. And that helps to give them a broader sense of this very diverse group of people. Even both inside the 40 million plus here, but also the ones elsewhere, right? To kind of say, look, it's very difficult to make these broad generalizations about this group for that reason. And I think that's a critical part of counter-stereotype resistance, is that we're doing that kind of thing. Similarly, the debunking thing is really important. I think we have those of us who are scholars, intellectuals, journalists, and that's a critical part that we do, right, is to remind people that, like, here's this thing that a lot of people think, but it's not really true, and here's the evidence, and so on, right? And I think that's critical. So, a lot of the controversy is over the cases where we think in our day-to-day interactions with people, like, what should we do? As you say, these are the harder questions, and so one thing to say about those cases, I wanted to emphasize that a lot of times what we're talking about, the forms of counter-stereotypic conduct that are relevant for my purposes are the ones where the trait in question is one, were you to have that negative trait, that would be bad. It'd be better if you had that trait. And you have already independent reason not to want it in a way, right? So the question isn't like how to kind of strive for something different. It's the thing you should be striving for. The question is, like, are there ways in the way in which you're conducting yourself that you could make it more palpable, more salient to others that you in fact have it, as opposed to doing things that might lead people to think you don't. Or maybe I'll put the other way around if it's negative. So if you thought, like, there could be situations where, to give one kind of example, maybe to talk about King a little bit, take something like anger, right? So I think a lot of people probably think of, I'm going to set aside whether anger isn't like an intrinsically bad thing. I don't think that. But you might think that certain kinds of violent behavior, violent tendencies, that's a bad thing. So I think King thought it's bad to kind of be, aggressive, justifiably aggressive toward others. And so that's the thing that one should try not to do. Try not to be the person who, is violently aggressive toward others. There might be situations where there are exceptions to that, obviously. And then there are going to be a bunch of proxies for that, right? Things that people are on the lookout for, they think is an indication that you might be a person who's disposed to act violently, right? So one of those things is being quick to anger, right? That's a kind of bit of evidence people use to figure out, is this person like a threat, right? And so that's a kind of case where you might think there'll be situations where sort of keeping your cool is counter-stereotypic, right? Not because it's bad to be angry. I mean, it can sometimes be fine and sometimes it's called for, I think. But there could be situations where it's important to indicate that you're not an unjustifiably aggressive person, and sort of keeping your cool is one way of indicating that. That's one kind of example you could think of. So again, the thought is there are things you shouldn't want to have those traits and tendencies, but people often can't discern those directly, right, whether you have those traits and tendencies. What they do is they're relying on various indicators of whether you have those traits and tendencies. And so part of the question is how you operate with respect to those various proxies. And of course, I should emphasize, there are often going to be overriding considerations where it makes sense for you not to do that, right? Sometimes it's important as a way of affirming your own self-respect that you don't do that, right? Sometimes it's just important if you feel like you've been aggrieved in a way, you might decide that in that situation you're not going to engage in that kind of counter-stereotypic behavior. In fact, you're going to maybe go the other way. As Professor Laurie points out, you could sometimes go the other way, and it might make sense because you might think this person, they're not a person that I'm likely to alter the way that they think by acting counter-stereotypically, and it might be important in that way to put up some form of symbolic protest, and maybe leaning in a little bit to a stereotype is appropriate. So it's one consideration, not always overriding, about whether you should try to enact counter-stereotypic conduct. How am I doing on time? Okay. Let me think. So, and I think that also goes to the question of the cost, right? I mean, like sometimes it's sort of too much to ask of a person. And this is like, my interest in a lot of these questions, my singular preoccupation is the race class nexus, right? So I've been like for many years, that's like the thing I'm most preoccupied. It's so difficult to think through that set of issues. And this is one of these cases, right, where, I sort of, as I reflect on this, I kind of thought, for people like us, it might be thought that, it's more reasonable to expect us to pay these costs than the most disadvantaged in the group. Not that we always should pay these costs, I don't want to say that, right? But that it can be, it's part of being amongst the most privileged members of a marginalized or stigmatized group that is trying to maintain some sense of solidarity as you try to bring about changes in the society and lessen the burden on the group. That sometimes we carry some of those burdens, and it's reasonable for us to do so, partly because we often benefit enormously by being among the most privileged in the group. So there's not a clean way to kind of sort those, but I say that to bring on the question of costs. There are going to be people who are so heavily burdened in other ways that it's not going to be reasonable to expect them to take this up. That is the counter-stereotypic conduct. And there might be situations where, even for those of us who are much more advantaged, that it's like too much to ask of us too. It might depend on the context. I don't mean it to be like every situation you find yourself in. Make sure you. So just to underline that point. Let's see. It's interesting thinking about like the hallway example I gave. I still don't know exactly what was the right thing to do in that situation. And I'd like to think that even though I didn't plan anything, that what in fact ensued actually was good, even though it was humiliating for us both. that in fact that she might walk away having learned something from that interaction. She might not have learned as much from it if I had, given her a lecture or gotten extremely angry with her or, went boo or whatever. That probably wouldn't have.
But you thought about it.
I don't know. It's a temperament thing. It's not really my way. But, those probably wouldn't have gotten much out of that. In a way, just, that it turned out that she made this mistake that was kind of humiliating for us both, probably, I like to think, probably stuck with her. Not sure, but, one certainly stuck with me. So King is interesting. It's hard to say about is he a kind of a model for what I'm talking about? I guess in some ways, yes. He is a model in that he's trying to, I think, to balance aggressive political action that is going to make a lot of people upset and sometimes murderous, right? So he's doing that at the same time that he's exhibiting like that, as one should, that we are prepared, Black people, we are prepared under the right conditions to engage with our fellow citizens with mutual respect and to be compliant with reasonable laws. We're prepared to do that. We do not harbor a retributive ethos. We're not going to punish you all. If what we're asking is for this change, and then he's enacting that in kind of in his personal conduct and how he's behaving, how he's interacting with people. That we just are asking for you to treat us with the respect and sense of justice that we're due. And somehow, acting in a way that kind of that says that you're inviting that reciprocity. I think he is trying to do that. I don't know. Some of the other things about how you dress or how you speak and so on. He might have had views I don't necessarily share about the importance of those things. I don't know. I don't know what his full views were about why he he's a minister, so certain things that go along with that, right? But outside of that. Did he think that it made a difference, his comportment and how he dresses? So I don't know, but I'd be curious. Professor Martin, what your thoughts about that question? One last thing I want to say, I should say something about my long-standing colleague, our former colleague, Professor Higginbotham, whose book, Righteous Discontent was the phrase respectability politics was coined in that, and she has a long discussion about the complexity of respectability politics. It's really complex. And I think I know she feels that a lot of the things people say about respectability politics, that's not what she was talking about. She wasn't trying to critique. At least not in a strong way. She recognized there were class dimensions to this, and she highlights that, and she recognizes the dangers of policing the worst off. She recognizes there are those things, but she did think there was something important about that they were trying to achieve, something good they were trying to achieve here. And I just wanted to note that because that's true. But one last part I'll end on this is that I do want to emphasize that the inward-facing dimension of this, because I think it's easy to kind of get overly focused on, the outward, like we're trying to, but the truth is, I was talking with Jennifer Hochschild yesterday about this, because there's somewhat limited data on, say, for instance, Black people's, to what extent Black people subscribe to negative stereotypes about their own group. There is some evidence, but not as much as one might like, and that's the kind of thing people are kind of looking into. There's some on the, what is it called, the General Survey? I forget what it's called. You guess it. General Survey. Yeah, there's some, but the samples are not that huge, and so it's an interesting question about that. But I take it that in the broader tradition, Black tradition of uplift, this was assumed. that a significant number of Black people held, or at least suspected, there was truth in these stereotypes, and that part of the point was to respond to that. And so if you think of, in the Black nationalist tradition, the focus on the lack of pride, worries about lack of self-love, worries about a sense of inferiority complex, where these stereotypes are seeped into the consciousness of Black people, and this is debilitating. Like, that's a heavy focus of that tradition. And part of the thought is, like, it's important to remind members of the group that they don't have reasons to be ashamed, right? And part of that is drawing their attention to, like, why I haven't been on 125th Street in New York in a while, but why are all these books there about, all the great things that Black people have done? It's not so that we can sell, well, maybe they do want to sell it to a lot of white people too, because there's money involved. But they want Black people to know, like this is a people you can be proud of. This is a people who you should feel comfortable affiliating with. You don't have to be ashamed. So part of, I take it, that the stereotypic conduct I'm talking about here, I think it's important to just remember that it does have this other side. That it's like when Jesse Jackson would talk about, I am somebody, so why is he doing all of that, right? And so I think when we're thinking about the challenges to it, and there are real challenges to stereotypic conduct, that we just always keep in mind that there is this other side to it, this inward focus, that would more or less call for the same conduct. I think, at least in many contexts. So I guess with that, I'll stop, and we can pursue the other things in conversation. Thank you.
So this has been so extraordinary. So thank you so much, Professor, for being here. This has been extraordinary. Thank you for being here. All 3 days have been extraordinary. So on this point about the inward-looking bit of it, just to note that you're exactly right. I mean, the data shows, in fact, that a lot of Black people hold these negative racial stereotypes and the like. And empirically, it also demonstrates that it corresponds with their embrace of the politics of respectability and this sort of willingness to police behavior within the group. So I wanted to think about a different cost that seems to have some normative meaning here, which is that as I show in my work on respectability, to sort of become preoccupied with this counter-stereotypic program that you've discussed, right, is to develop in the self a set of ideas and habits and beliefs that have the consequence of helping to sustain a system of racial hierarchy. That is, that these folks who embrace the politics of respectability are more likely to punish their own, right, who violate normative expectations or who behave in stereotype consistent ways. And I presume that at the goal of the exercise that you've walked us through is something close to justice, something about disrupting racial hierarchy. And so if what I said is true, that to embrace the politics of respectability, to believe in this counter-stereotypic program, is to behave in a fashion that further marginalizes one's own, that sustains racial hierarchy instead of disrupting it, that seems to have some meaningfulness for this program that you suggested, that it does the very opposite. Maybe it has some benefit, but whatever benefit it has is paired with great cost to the most marginalized members of the group. And so I wanted to hear you say a little something about this real cost of sustaining racial hierarchy that at least in my work I've shown.
Thanks so much for that question. I appreciate your paper as well, and this was really helpful as I was thinking through some of these questions. I mean, I guess maybe we could talk about I don't know, the good and bad parts of a punitive response to failures to participate in counter-stereotypic resistance, right? So you can imagine there are cases where, part of it is the kind of penalty. So if it's one thing to draw attention to take someone to draw attention to the fact that they're behaving in ways that are going to reinforce a stereotype, and to express disapproval in that way. Blaming attitudes, if you like, is quite another. To call the police or so I think the type of penalty is going to make a difference, and I think that we were talking earlier about this book by, I can't think of his first name right now. I think his last name is Stark. He wrote a book about Black solidarity, and he talking about the epithets Uncle Tom and sellout, and as like what role do they play in Black solidarity, for instance, or other groups use these terms sometimes too. And his theory was that these are informal sanctions on people who either show a lack of fidelity to the group's basic commitments, so a lack of loyalty to it, or they try to benefit at the expense of the group. It's a sellout one. By labeling them, kind of Uncle Toms and sellouts, one is kind of given an informal sanction because they're not really satisfying the norms of group solidarity. And so I think that's something like that, something that at least does that same function is probably true in any form of group solidarity. There'll be something that plays that role, and I wouldn't necessarily want to reject that entirely, that there might be a place. The trouble is, as we discussed yesterday with Professor Hochschild's great comments, is that some of the strategies that people are using to try to change things, there's great uncertainty about their effectiveness. And it's harder to decide whether it would be appropriate to, hold someone accountable for not engaging in it when there's so much uncertainty about whether it will be effective. So if you think people have a duty, including the oppressed, to resist oppression, to try to change things for the better, you think everybody has that, even the most disadvantaged have that, and you think, as I do, that these are these little bit of philosophical jargon, kind of imperfect duties. They are duties that require a certain amount of judgment and discretion about how you carry them out, like when it's appropriate to do it and when not. So if you apply that kind of thought, that you have a certain amount of discretion about how to carry out your part in resistance, and you join that with the thought that there can be a lot of uncertainty about which strategies are likely to work, you could see why one might want to be back off from really strong punitive responses to people's failures. Because as you've seen in this discussion, there's a lot of disagreement about would this do any good? So I'm not inclined to think that you would want to have a highly punitive response to a lack of fidelity to the program, partly for that reason, even as I acknowledge that I think something like that is appropriate in any form of group solidarity that's aimed at resistance, protecting the group, and trying to change things. I hope that helps at least somewhat.
Very helpful, thank you. So I'd like to go back to the first lecture and the discussion on generics, the form of, B's are V, if you say blacks are violent or something like this. And so the thought is to try to ask how much work does it take to actually break that sort of way of thinking? I mean, that seemed to be important in terms of the whole effectiveness question. And just the thought is that way of thinking perhaps a primitive, whether you call it a cognitive primitive or a behavioral primitive? If we take the world of nature, and let's say my thought is lions are dangerous. Probably not universally true. Some lions have eaten recently and so on. But if I'm in a sort of state of nature, the false negative is potentially vastly costly, where the false positive is not costly at all. I run away from the lion who's not going to eat me. Okay, I live another day. I don't run away from the lion who is going to beat me. I don't. And so the thought is this a transfer? And the problem is the transfer of this primitive from the world of nature, whether it's mosquitoes or lions and so on, to the world of culture or society, where indeed the false negative does in fact have real costs to you who are hurt by the behavior of the woman running down the and then broadly speaking in the society as a whole. So just the thought is that yes, there's no question that is a real problem, but is it a really deep problem because it actually goes back to a way our minds or emotions work based on something that was actually highly adaptive in the first place?
Yeah. You guys are full of easy questions, I see today. And maybe I'll invite Anthony if he has thoughts about this to think about it, because this question. I mean, it's there's. So I take it two sides to this. So there's the. Most of what I focused on was the way of thinking, and part of what you're bringing out has to do with often when we're relying on these generalizations, it has to do with what we're gonna do. So, and what we're going to do, because, the mosquitoes and lions don't really care what we think about them. Certain things certain questions don't arise, but they do, for us. So you got a whole other set of considerations, and it's hard to know how to weigh them, right? So in some of these cases, you might think it would be reasonable in some cases. I do in some cases for women in vulnerable situations to take evasive action, not just because it's a black man or a dark man, but because it's a man. You might think, depending on the situation, it might make sense to, stakes are very high, it makes sense to take some kind of evasive action in that situation. I would agree. And then the questions about how to do that, I think will be relevant. And I do think, I think a lot of women think about that, about what's an appropriate way to kind of respond in that kind of case that isn't going to insult the other or humiliate everybody and so on. And it might involve some performance, whether that's, maybe it's hard to, you already have to have a plan or a kind of policy what you're gonna do in these situations. But you could imagine, if the woman I interacted with in the hallway, if she had just returned and went the other direction, performed getting a call, whatever, any kind of form, then it would have been a very different interaction. It was, so I do think that when we're talking about not just the moral cost of how we think of one another, but also about how we ought to act toward one another, how we ought to conduct ourselves. That you're going to say complicated things, but part of the reason I was putting Anthony in this spot, there's partly the question about whether the fear is in some cases really irrational, and in some cases I think it is, right? And even though we have the primitive response, you're pointing to, it's important for us to be reflective about that and to think about when are we appropriate. I think a lot of people after the 9/11 attack, there's a kind of visceral response a lot of people had whenever they sort of saw someone that looked like they might be Muslim. Even though, as Anthony pointed out, it was like a million Muslims. I mean, what are you talking about? There's nobody you're interacting with. The chances that they're going to do anything to you is if we do have to be reflective of that. Like, what's the likelihood there's any real danger here as well? And I think in the case of these kind of striking property generics, that's the worry. I don't know if you had anything you want to say on this.
I mean, the point you made, Josh, is a point that's made in the Sarah Jane Leslie dissertation on generics. That, I mean, she thinks it's a sort of primitive mode of generalization, and she's done studies with children where it's just fantastically easy to get them to generate all kinds of generics and waste of almost nothing. So I think she thinks it's a basic form of, as you said, and she also makes the point that you made, though her example was tigers eat people, not lions and donkeys, that in the context of our evolution, the big mistake with a negative property is not overestimating, it is underestimating. So you can sort of figure out, we can give an evolutionary psychological reason for why it has these negative property generics have the property they do. I'd just say that, I mean, I think my own view is that Tommie's response is the right one, which is that because we're not children, we're adults, and because we know these things about generics, we have a duty to be careful when we find them popping up in our heads, to think about what, whether what they're leading us to worry about is in fact something to worry about, and even if it is in these circumstances, whether there isn't a respectful way of acting on it when it's a belief about another person. And it seems to me, there's the right things to say about what we should do. And I think, but as Tommie also said, these sorts of situations arise a lot where you have to make these decisions. So it's good to think about them ahead of time and have a plan for what you're going to do. Which, as you know, as he also said, many women, have face circumstances where they have given the way the world is, a reasonable worry. But you can act on it in a way that doesn't insult the particular person, about whom it is almost always going to be true that the probability that they are going to do something is pretty small. So you're insulting someone, there's a very low probability of being dangerous, though it's the kind of danger that it's reasonable to be incredibly vigilant about.
It's great. I mean, the lion is not insulted.
No.
The human is, and therefore we have to try to push to make that distinction.
Thanks. Great. So I'll echo the thanks for all of this wonderful discussion. This has been, so interesting and a lot to chew on. And this is really good because I wanted to follow up, I think, on a similar line of questioning to Josh's, which is about asymmetric risk and the ethics of belief and situations in which there may be stereotypes at work, but it's not really clear on which side the risk is sort of weightier. So I think in particular about situations where you're dealing with someone who's in a role like Ms. Johnson's, where their job is to provide individualized support for people based on what they need. And there seems like risk on both sides in failing to identify when children are in need of extra support and when they're not. So I think in particular about like young boys who are disproportionately diagnosed with ADHD. You may think there are probably some stereotypes at work in terms of how their behavior is interpreted. But I think there's also a sort of concern that a sort of failure to refer children for sort of additional support could be a real problem. I think it also becomes serious in thinking about adults, and I think in particular about like examples of like women of a certain age who might, show up to work looking kind of sick one day. And ordinarily, if I had saw someone who was looking kind of sick, especially if it was a student, I might say, hey, you should maybe go home, get some rest. However, there's a higher likelihood that women in a certain age group are pregnant, and telling them to go home when they feel sick is to sort of, deny them equal standing in the workplace when they're in that situation. And so I think that there are some situations in which, like, the kind of acknowledgement of difference is important, and I'm not totally sure how to think about the kind of ethics of belief in those situations.
I think these are the right questions because we're trying to figure out when it's appropriate to act on a generalization. And there's a lot to take into account, as you rightly point out. I mean, I mostly was, at least in the Ms. Johnson example, was kind of conceding that were she to rely on the generalization about intellectual deficiencies of Black people, she's very likely to wrong her students in that case. I would, so I certainly want to concede that it may make sense to take any action on it would probably require a lot more evidence than she could possibly have had available to her. And there's some complicated questions about, like, I don't know how to sort that if teachers often do know a lot about their students. And I don't know how to answer whether, you making assessment about your students' ability to figure out, like, what's the best way to help them learn, whether it would be wrong to allow that generalization to be a part of that. And that's a hard question. I'm curious if people have thoughts about that, like whether that could play any kind of role, or whether that should just be set aside and you should only rely on really particularistic evidence about the person. I don't know how to answer that, but all of those are about how we rely on the evidence, that this array of evidence, but when we're trying to figure out how we're going to interact or act or take action, and people can be harmed. And they can be harmed at that just because of what they think is behind it, too, right? So not because on my hypothesis, the way the story is set up, she's doing everything she can to help them learn, right? So, but they could still regard the action as condescending. That you don't believe I can, do this work, but I can, and people take offense to that kind of thing. And so the actions she might be taking could be interpreted in that way, and that would be bad as well. But I don't know how to sort those particular things, except to concede that there's many ways in which you might wrong someone by acting on generalizations of this sort. But I feel like I'm missing a part of your question. I just want to make sure that I'm not.
Sure. So I think my question was about situations. So I took part of the argument from the first lecture to be that an appropriate sort of ethics of belief involves a kind of sort of suspension of judgment, or a kind of a hesitation to make inferences about people based on generalizations. I mean, in some respects, regardless of whether they're true, especially if they're false, but, presumably we believe things because we think they're true. But that relies on an assumption that the risk is asymmetric, that the risk of a false positive is worse than the risk of a false negative, and that in situations where your role is to provide individualized, differentiated support for people based on these kind of individual characteristics, you may be aware that your kind of assessment of the evidence is biased in a whole bunch of ways by various kind of consciously and unconsciously held beliefs, but you may still think that it's not entirely clear, where you should err in these cases about whether you should err on the side of referring any child that you think might need it, even if it's possible that you're sort of referring more children than you really should, or if you should err on the side of just waiting until you have overwhelming evidence before you do it.
Right. No, agreed about the concern. And there's I think as you started the comment about there could be a range of professional responsibilities as well that are, which I didn't really highlight, but obviously it's going to be relevant that this is a teacher, and they have certain responsibilities about how they're going to interact with their students, and that's going to, and often general policy will dictate, so they're not necessarily acting on just their judgment in these particular cases, but these are the norms for how you interact with your students that might allow to factor some of these things in you're talking about, to kind of not leave that to the discretion of professionals. It's harder, I think, in the informal interaction what to say.
So thank you. I will start with the question so it's very clear. The question I have is in response to that hallway scenario where you're walking along and the woman is approaching or making problematic behaviors in response to you walking in that hallway. My question is, how is the response to that situation, the moral obligation, to be anything other than self-preservation in terms of protecting your own dignity? And the reason why I ask this is even the very act of engagement opens you up to enormous risks towards further assaults to your dignity. Not even just your moral dignity, but also your physical safety. So I'm going to just use a very quick personal example of how risky it can be to actually engage in these kinds of circumstances. So as a gay individual, I have, over the course of 30 years of life, been in many circumstances like this. And I've tried many, many different ways of engaging in these kinds of scenarios. Most of them have involved failures for the very similar reasons that you've already mentioned. But one of them, a 7-year-old crying in basically the classroom, or crying in the jungle gym, where you try an emotional appeal. You're literally showing how your dignity has been slighted, and you're emotionally appealing towards empathy. You are opening yourself up to essentially a further assault on your dignity, which actually happened as a young person. So, enormous risk. I've also tried the teenage, how dare you? You're such a prick. How dare you treat me that way? I'll show you, et cetera, et cetera. That really didn't work. It just further escalated the situation. I've also tried an even more, I would say, deeply problematic move, which is, I'm this upstanding Stanford student as an 18-year-old, how dare you treat me that way? Which was utilizing another lever of power that other people might not have access to. I'm a lawyer, I'm a doctor, whatever. We've all heard these kinds of narratives before, where you're using one lever of power to address the situation in deeply problematic ways. Not everyone has access to other levers of power in these situations. I've also done the ignore, completely walk away, because that's going to be the best thing you can possibly do in this particular situation to actually preserve your own dignity. And that has seemed to unfortunately be the most successful way to actually engage in these highly charged situations. I mean, in the hallway, if someone is responding in a context of fear, your options, I think, are very limited given the charged environment. I mean, if you think about all the different things that could possibly happen in that situation, if you engage earnestly, the person might accuse you like, oh, how dare you treat me? How dare you assume that I don't know what I'm doing? I'm going to call the police right now. I mean, you have no idea what that person's going to do in this situation. So I hate to be pessimistic, but I'm very much at a loss for what you are actually supposed to do in these situations where you're with a stranger in an unfamiliar environment where there might be a charged atmosphere already. It seems like the best thing is self-preservation, self-dignity protection. And that's certainly the only thing that's morally required. Maybe it's supererogatory to take that risk and engage. But in the terms of moral requirements, I would say self-dignity protection is the thing that you have to do, and anything else is a supreme risk. And if you're successful, that's a supererogatory act that you're willing to take.
So when I was talking about counter-stereotype resistance, it's meant to be a kind of collective, general strategy to enhance the public image of a group and to repair a damaged self-concept. And the cases of what you should do in particular interpersonal interactions, maybe in some ways by starting with the hallway example, it might be misleading in a way because I'm imagining cases of like this, how you're just conducting yourself kind of generally, like rather than a case where the person has already stereotyped you, right? So there's the case where the person has already made a conclusion about you on the basis of a stereotypic generalization and are treating you accordingly. All kinds of other things are now in play, as you rightly point out. And maybe by starting with that example, it made it seem like that's the cases rather than thinking about like how one is conducting oneself generally before you've actually been mistreated, before you have reason to think a person has drawn a conclusion about you on the basis of a stereotype, and whether the ways you're conducting yourself helps as a part of a general strategy to get people to have a more accurate, less harmful way of viewing the group you're a part of. The second thing I would say is, this is a part of a political morality of resistance. So it's not just understood as like, our ordinary moral duties with respect to one another, right? So, and I might agree with you, in some cases it would be supererogatory to go this extra mile, but if you thought that, you're a part of a group that's jointly committed to trying to change things, you've committed yourself to this, you've taken a particular approach to it. It involves a certain solidarity and certain kinds of tactics with the hope of trying to improve things and lessen the weight on the group. And so these are in some ways duties that you've signed up for, as it were, right? You have the general duty, right? I think to do your part to kind of to kind of make things better. I think everybody has that, to try to make things more just. And that will be, how heavy that is will partly depend on how you're situated with respect to the injustice, right? But I think, the thing I'm talking about is about, well, the group, or at least some members of it, are committing themselves to trying to change things for the better. And the question is, well, how do you do that? And this is one approach, part of a range of other strategies that sometimes I think may be more important, to trying to do something about it. And so you're committing yourself to those people to play your part in that. So there, I wouldn't say it's supererogatory. You're committing yourself to engaging us, and in some ways taking on some of the burdens to go along with that. So you can see it by looking at more traditional forms of, more familiar, I should say, forms of collective resistance. So when we think about, the Montgomery bus boycott, which, whenever I read about it, I almost get teary-eyed, but it's so amazing what they did, right? It's like enormously burdensome. I think it went over like 13 months. People were like doing this and walking miles. It's incredible. But they're doing it as a part of a broader thing. They're trying to bring about a change, or committing themselves to this. Is why, King and others could be very critical of people who are not, doing their part. So that's the context I'm talking about, and I think that how we think about what our responsibilities are in there, I think, are somewhat different from the kind of ordinary interpersonal relations that we might have to one another.
I have a follow-up question there. So is it a commitment to a goal or a commitment to a strategy? Because what you're laying out here is a strategy to achieve a goal, and we could specify the goal, I'm not sure, but resisting stereotypes, is that the goal? Is the goal a more just society? Because in answer to his question, when you say you have a duty, the duty would only, I assume, occur if you have committed to the strategy. Because you could commit to the goal without committing to the strategy, and engage in multiple strategies and still be consistent with your duty or commitment.
Yes.
But as you lay it out here, and you say the resisting stereotypes, you have the three prongs. That seems to be a strategy. So I'm just curious if what you were suggesting is a commitment to this strategy or commitment to a goal.
I think the duty is going to spring from initially, I think, from commitment to the goal, right? So you're trying to reduce the prevalence of these stereotypes, right? So that's what you're trying to do. You might do many different things to try so you're committed to trying to reduce the power and extent of these stereotypes. But you can, I think, people do sometimes commit to a strategy, right, as well, right? So part of when you think about when people were promoting this, they were trying to, and they're talking about, in the church, they're talking about it in all these countries, they're trying to get everybody to sign on to this, right? Like, here's the thing we're going to do. And trying to get people to commit to that, because it only works if enough people commit to doing it, right? Your own individual interaction with someone is not going to make much difference, right? So you can. So you've got, like, if you think, as we talk about, the commitment to the struggle, we're trying to reduce racial injustice and its impact on people. You're trying to do that, or a range of different things we're trying to do. We don't always know whether they're going to be effective or not, but in some cases like in the more concrete cases, we're like, well, what we're going to do is we're going to boycott. We're not going to, support this particular business or this particular, or whatnot. That's a strategy, and we might get people to commit to that, and you try to persuade them to do so. So I'm imagining this is a similar thing. It's like, but there's a long tradition of this. People have promoted this kind of for a long time. It is currently contested, as obviously, that now people question, like, is this really something that we should be doing? Is it effective? Is it, and all the reasons I was trying to raise in the lecture, maybe we shouldn't sign on to this, we should reject that and do something else. Yeah. But I think you can commit to a strategy and then be held accountable for whether or not you have shown sufficient fidelity to it.
Yeah, because the question made me think that if there are strategies that require solidarity to be effective. Yeah. So if you commit to that strategy, you commit to solidarity in the face of costs, right? That I see. But if you commit to a larger goal, let's say justice, racial justice, whatever, and then you're saying that, look, I don't necessarily commit to any particular strategy. I'm going to use whatever strategy is available, but I still am committed to this community in terms of this goal. Then I think that suggests a different set of behaviors. And what I hear in his question is, like, is that not? And so I guess and this is maybe what I am to that question. Is, do I have a moral obligation to engage in a particular strategy as a function of being committed to a larger goal that is in operating in the community that we're part of? And I think that a lot of people have that kind of stress or concern, right? So when I go into a situation, like, how should I behave? I feel committed to my community. I feel committed to this larger goal. What strategies does that then commit me to, because they require solidarity? And do I feel, am I willing to take that cost? And there's sometimes confusion for me, I'll speak for myself, about what strategies my commitment to the larger goal and my solidarity with the community commit me to, because I have not said, here are the strategies, here's the number of strategies available, and I have committed to these strategies. When you have the boycott, it's very clear, right? We are going to boycott. This boycott requires solidarity. If you're going to be with the people, don't get on that damn bus, right? Like, that's what it's clear. But in life, there's all these strategies you can enact. They have not been called out as these require solidarity. You've not committed to a particular strategy. You've committed to the community and to the goal, and therefore there's, I think, often confusion about what your moral responsibility is in any given situation in terms of how you behave.
Yeah, I agree. I think with everything you just said, that's in many cases. I mean, these are questions of political judgment. about when it makes sense to take up this or that strategy, right? And these are they're hard questions. And in my own work of thinking about solidarity, I try to take that into account, that there is can be great disagreement about what's most likely to be the most effective collective strategy, and that should affect how we regard one another as like, are you really showing a lack of fidelity to the cause? And it could be what you're showing is disagreement about whether this is the most effective way of proceeding, and so charges of being Uncle Tom or Sal are not really appropriate, because that's not really what's going. And so there'll be cases where you think it's relatively evident that it'll be better. Well, I shouldn't say that. Everything's controversial, but you can imagine like a debate, and it has happened many times. Like a question will arise about whether Black people should vote in this election or whatnot, right? And so I think for a lot of people, they feel like it's stakes are sufficiently high. We're not going to do well if certain kinds of outcomes happen, and that it would be irresponsible for people not to do their bit. And when we saw that in Georgia, whatnot, right? So people were like, no, this this matters. We all need to show up, and it would be appropriate, I think, to be critical of people who didn't see that. I think there are other cases are just less clear about whether it will be this is the most effective way of proceeding. So I certainly want to concede that in this case it may be unclear. That's why I kind of welcome what Jennifer Hochschild was saying, like that. Let's look at what we know. Let's look at the research and let's try to figure out, did this make any difference to these changes? We know there were changes in people's political attitude. It's not a question. The question is, did this play any role in that? And I think that has to figure in both whether we commit to it and whether we're critical of people who don't commit to it.
Jen Morton. So thanks, Tommie. This has been great. I had a question about class and race and the relative burdens that the more advantaged have relative to the least advantaged. I was just thinking that there's a way in which what would be more counter-stereotypic would be for the least advantaged. So to act in counter-stereotypic ways. So I was just thinking, like Trump was an example of this, but all these stereotypes about Hispanics being ignorant or lazy or whatever, right? And so like I, as a Latina Ivy League professor, can go around reading books and like looking very scholarly and all this stuff, and like that might disrupt the stereotype in some people's minds. But if they have the stereotype in a certain classed way, that's not going to change how they look at the cleaner in their house or the gardener or the janitor. And so as much as I can go around trying to be counter-stereotypic, that the stereotype will still stick, right? So they sent their worst people. Like that will still stick. And if we're thinking about advancing social justice generally, I worry about it being a strategy that ends up with the elite kind of benefiting from being like, okay, not all Hispanics are this way. There's these ones are not, right? And like we can see them reading their books and doing their things. But it's still going to stick to the more marginalized group. Like they're still going to be seen as more ignorant, lazy, whatever it is. And in some ways, that's not within my power to disrupt. Yeah.
No, great question. I mean, part of this is, so I'm talking about racial stereotypes, and a stereotype, say, about a group I've written a lot about, so about the ghetto poor. So you could have a stereotype that's about the ghetto poor. It's not about Black people, but it's about the ghetto poor. Like, and that will be different, and maybe there are different ways of responding to that, which is different from a racial stereotype about the whole group. So I was mostly talking about the latter, that like there are various generalizations about the group and what they're like, and there, even if the worst off in the group didn't really participate, if enough others who are not among the most disadvantaged did, it could be made more manifest that, that the generalization about the group as a whole doesn't really hold, right? It could be that some members of the most disadvantaged group behave in ways that seem to confirm the stereotype in question. And I was trying to suggest that it, while one might welcome participation from the most worst off, and that it would be not reasonable to blame them if they didn't want to participate. But it would be a different thing if you thought, I have some colleagues who had these discussions with Robert Gooding Williams, Brandon Cherry, and others who I think that we may have, if we haven't already approached a point where there's been, certain subgroups are really the target of the hostility, and it's not the group as a whole. And that would require, if that were true, if it's true, it's like, it's not that blacks are violent and don't take care of their children properly and so are irresponsible about reproduction and so on. It's just this subgroup. I think that does, if that's right, that's what's going on. I think that does change what's the right response to it. And you could think that, in the cases when people are acting in a kind of self-serving way, they're relying on something like that assumption. That is, they're thinking, someone might confuse me for a member of that group. So they're not so much thinking all the members of this group this, or most of them do this, but they notice a subgroup and they are using your racial classification as a proxy for the possibility you might be a part of that group, right? That's a slightly different phenomenon, I think, related obviously, but maybe that's not the right approach to that problem. I try to talk about it a little bit in Dark Ghettos, because I guess in that book it's like I'm trying to focus on that group, subgroup, and they have the particular kinds of challenges that, and I think it might be generalizable to the other kinds of cases you're thinking of.
Can I ask a quick follow-up on that? I wonder how you think about everybody's going to go. How you think about essentialism in that case? Because if race is essentialized, you don't necessarily have to see an outward manifestation of let's call it a particular stereotype to believe that they still hold some of that essence. So as an example, your blacks are criminal. That's an essential feature of the group. The group, I have an essentialist view of the group. You might not demonstrate criminality, but you still have a propensity to criminality. You just have been prevented from expressing that propensity. And so it's a different way of saying, like, you could do it still as someone who has in a position to present as not criminal. You benefit from that, but you've not done anything for the stereotype, and it doesn't require a subtyping, right? This is what in psychology would be called subtyping. It doesn't require me to think that you are other than. Like, no, you're still, you're still Latina. They're still, dumb in my mind. You just have not, for whatever reason, have not expressed it. You've been dressed up in pretty clothes, but in the end, we still know it's true. There's that kind of, and that seems to be something that humans have, when you can just demonstrate that children have this kind of essentialist way of engaging with the world and animals and people, and that is a feature of it. So I just wonder, how do you think about the counter-stereotypic program if people are racial essentialists?
Yeah, that's interesting. So here's the thought, if I'm understanding. So what's being attributed to the group is a disposition to act in certain ways, maybe under certain circumstances. And it's acknowledged that, they won't display, that disposition won't manifest itself in every circumstance or in every person that's a member of the group, but everybody has the disposition. And maybe in that case that, counter-stereotypic personal conduct is probably not going to have much of an impact on that, and it might require one of the other forms of debunking resistance to try to bring out and I think a lot of intellectuals have tried to do, right, is to try to show that no, actually there's no such as no racial essence, or their work like that. It's nothing like that. This is confused. That's a more appropriate form of resistance when what's really going on is this kind of essentialism where you're attributing a hidden disposition. So I don't want to suggest that, at least in the case of counter-stereotypic personal conduct, that's necessarily going to be effective in that context.
I'd like to follow up a little bit on my question from yesterday evening to more precisely state what I think the potential dispute is, not because I have a considered view, but because I think it's a dialogue worth pursuing. You've said today that it's a hard thing to say what exactly one should do in these very particular cases, the valet, the hallway, et cetera. But what your view seems to imply, if I've got it right, is that at least comparatively advantaged or comparatively privileged Black people should be disposed to dealing with stereotypes and social expectations and standards in a certain way, that there's a kind of disposition needed. And if that's the case, then it seems like the whole ballgame consists in getting clear about what the content of this disposition is and what the potential costs are, what work it does. I mentioned one view last night in a longer passage from James Baldwin. There's a much shorter remark elsewhere in the conversation that gives the sense of the thing. He says in a very powerful tone of voice that no white critic could ever judge me. I'd be a fool if I depended on that judgment. As a white critic of Baldwin, I think maybe he's got my number here. Baldwin's answer is that how you should be so disposed if you're a Black person in a white society is that you've got to try your very best to, in a lived way, abstract from the standards and expectations of that society, that this is the attitude necessary for self-knowledge and self-realization, and so for willing to be a powerful exemplar of Black individuality. And that might have counter-stereotypic value in itself. That in a very real sense, the judgment is beneath contempt. That's how you repair self-image. I think that suggests something about the connection between some freedom that you recognize might be lost in adopting the sort of disposition you think can be needed, and the worry of self-alienation that you mentioned earlier in the presentation. And then further, it seems like you've provided an answer and a claim that I think is really important, and I want to hear more about, that self-respect demands an answer to the judgment, a lettered answer that constitutes a real kind of engagement. Mm-hmm. And why does it? And why is this not a case where, a la Baldwin, no answer is an answer?
So I do think that, so when I gave the two possible responses to the sour grapes charge, one of them I mostly responded to, which is that you don't want to dismiss people and to say you don't really merit my engagement at all for the reasons I gave. But there's a further thought about whether you need to regard the judgment, respect the judgment. So I do want to concede that it can be cases where the right response is to regard the judgment as not worth engagement, which is different from not regarding the person as engaged, not seeing them as someone who could change. And I think that's what I was trying to avoid. But it could be cases where the person is like ill-informed, not willing to really think about things very carefully. Maybe there are other things, attitudes they're harboring, and the right response to that would be to see their judgment as warranting your contempt or dismissal. So I don't want to take that off the table. I just wanted to emphasize, and partly by emphasizing the fact that since we're all prone to these faulty generalizations about various groups, that we don't want to be so dismissive that we just think, if the person holds a stereotype, then I don't need to do anything, because that's going to be true for all of us, as it turns out. And then we need to all hold some of these stereotypes about some groups that are troubling. And I take it that it's appropriate to think that we could in fact do better, and if engaged in the right way, we might even try.
Professors Lowry and Martin have given us unusually perceptive and probing and wise comments today. They really deserve such thanks. Thank you so much.